Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 2.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the internet, and welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Jazwa, and this is Season 2, Episode 8, The Octopus, Part 1, What Really Happened to Danny Casolaro. And I hate to get serious right here on the intro. I try to always keep these a little bit more lighthearted. And this story is way bigger than any single event, but it does have elements of several true crime stories, and I don't cover this that much because they involve the deaths of real people and people with families out there still who are still dealing with the repercussions of those deaths every single day. So before I even get started tonight, I just want to go ahead and send my condolences to the families of Danny Casolaro, Fred Alvarez, Patricia Castro, Ralph Boger, and Paul Maraska. I hope that one day justice is served and that closure can finally be brought to all of you. And it's in the spirit of that hope that I share their stories tonight. Small warning, tonight's episode does contain brief mentions of alleged self-harm. So if that is something that you aren't comfortable with, you can probably be basically safe if you skip 10-20 minutes in, or just skipping this series altogether, because it does have several mentions of that. It's a big key element in this case, but your mental health and well-being is far more important to me and is always going to mean more to me than any kind of play count. So if you need to excuse yourself, I completely understand. There's lots of other great content on here that you can listen to in the meantime. We have a lot to cover tonight, though, and it is going to be quite the ride, so buckle up. And with all of that out of the way, let's just go ahead and get into it. I'm going to call this part off the front here, prelude. I had no intentions of getting into another multi-part series, for the record, guys, especially involving, weeks of research and mountains of information to dig through. My intentions with this podcast starting off was to revisit stories that I've previously researched and that I've written on over the years, and find interesting news stories that I feel have been undercovered along the way, to hopefully bring together a community of like minds. And I wanted to do that in hopes of sparking some renewed interest in these stories, and I guess with the lofty ambition of somehow together maybe we could move at least a few of them forward. If nothing else, I guess I hope that I can inspire someone that might be able to. What I didn't expect was for it to reawaken in me a long buried journalistic drive to seek the truth myself, and often at all costs. I could have picked the easy and entertaining stories that so many other people have covered to death and just tried to put my spin on it, I guess, or, without having to personally spend weeks digging through documents and compiling research and everything that goes into these. And some of you out there may have even enjoyed that a little bit more if I did, but I knew personally that it would be unfulfilling, and inevitably I would just burn out from it. So I've endeavored to seek the hard stories when I need to, the ones that really needed answers, and to dig in and do my very best to provide those, or at least to point to the most logical theory if nothing else. This story is no different in that sense. but in others, it's far more complex than anything else I've ever looked into by far. At first, I thought I could just deliver the evidence as we know it and hope to bring more interest to the case, one that was much more obscure when I actually started looking into it months ago, by the way, and be able to leave it at that. But I was wrong, of course. The more I looked, the more I found, and like so many before me, the more it started to consume me. I found myself dissatisfied with just gathering details. I needed answers. I didn't want to tell part of the story if I couldn't tell it all. And more than anything, I didn't want to do a disservice to the material. If I was going to cover this, I was going to do it to the very best of my ability, and as it deserves to be done. A few months into working on this, I learned of a Netflix docuseries actually. This seems to happen pretty often whenever I decide to cover something, especially when it's something that I haven't seen covered very much. I almost decided to give up. I figured, what's the point? I'm sure they will cover it better than I can anyway, and at least it will get more much needed attention on the case. So I kind of shelved it, and I did episode 7. I also put it to a vote with the Discord group, along with another story that I was working on. Since there seemed to be some interest there, I decided to go back and to give it another look, though. I also decided to watch the docuseries to see how it was covered and if it would be worth doing it, or if I would just be retelling what they had put out. While Christian, the narrator in it, and the investigator, definitely dove in with both feet and did a very impressive job of getting to sources and gathering documents and trying to put the pieces together. I couldn't help but notice a few errors and still quite a bit missing. Whether this was intentional, I'll never know, but I suspect at very least some of it was. When I was digging for info online, I found tons of baseless speculation, misinformation, disinformation, and what I can only assume are complete fabrications in an effort to connect extra dots or to make this story more interesting or this conspiracy more grand. The thing is, though, it's completely unnecessary. This case, based purely on the known facts, and even if you left out the further reaches of this octopus of Danny's, is fascinating. It's heartbreaking, it's intriguing, and it's full of plenty of twists and turns as it is. So I decided I had to do it. The story deserves to be told, and told fully, without all the added conspiracies and conjecture that so many have muddied the waters with. If I was going to do it, I had to do it right. I couldn't tell part of the story, so back in I went to try and gather all the facts to try to put it together in the most logical way and to seek the documents that I would need to substantiate the conclusions that I was starting to come to after examining all of the facts. While none of that was easy, that last part would certainly prove to be the most challenging. Depositions, unsealed and declassified documents that had already been successfully FOIA'd took some time and digging, but the hurdles truly started when I began submitting my own requests and attempting to get my hands on what I felt would be the final pieces needed to better substantiate my conclusions. Everything from no documents found pertaining to your search criteria, scope is too broad, request falls under exemption, all the way to the documents not found in the expected location, and documents being sealed by request of the DOJ and others, which at least made this round of requests free, but it certainly didn't do any good as far as, progressing the case for me, or giving me the evidence that I needed to reach any kind of a satisfying conclusion. I'm still waiting on one more at the time of recording this, and if it should be successful, then it may change the entire trajectory of this story. For now, though, I'm just going to stick to what I know to be true. I said a moment ago that I needed to tell the whole story. Given the scope of this story, though, and all the parts that seemingly connect across, nearly 40 years, that's a very, very daunting task, and one that I'm not sure you, the audience, would even be interested in, to be totally honest. Not to mention, it would yet again require not only the 3 to 4 episodes that this will likely require to get through, in any kind of a meaningful way, but to really fully lay it all out would take most of the rest of the season. Being a history buff myself, I find a lot of the details that loosely connect to the story but had significant impact on the nation fascinating. Unfortunately, to get through this and keep it interesting to the most listeners and not take up the better part of the latter half of this season, I'm going to have to fight that urge to get too in-depth with some of the events that we'll be discussing. If I gloss over something in the process that you don't know about and need more info on, aside from just like a Wikipedia entry, feel free to reach out in the Discord or shoot me an email at clandestinradiopodcast@gmail.com, and I will do my very best to answer any questions that you might have. Now, with that very long and possibly over-detailed as usual intro out of the way, let's get into the reason that you clicked this episode and endeavor to begin unraveling one of the biggest conspiracies in U.S. history, the Octopus, starting at the only logical place, the very mysterious death of Danny Casolaro. Part 1. The End. August 10th, 1991, at 12:51 p.m., Sheraton Hotel at 301 Foxcroft Avenue in Martinsburg, West Virginia. A hotel maid unlocked the door to room 517, probably expecting to find linens to wash and cleaning to be done. The room's occupant should have been long gone by now, so I'm sure they weren't expecting to be greeted by much more than some empty pizza boxes, a couple bottles or something. For the most part, the room looked as expected. That was until they entered the bathroom and were greeted by a sight that I'm sure stuck with them for the rest of their lives. Blood, and lots of it, all around the bathroom, sprayed across the shower wall and filling up the tub, where a man lay dead with a total of 12 deep wounds across both of his wrists, one of them so deep that it severed a tendon. The sight was so disturbing that it caused the hotel employee who discovered it to allegedly pass out. Soon after, the Martinsburg police and County Coroner James L. Frost would arrive on the scene. After a brief investigation involving primarily the discovery of a 2-sentence alleged suicide note, it would be ruled a suicide pending an autopsy. This alleged suicide note read, quote, "To my loved ones, please forgive me, most especially my son, and be understanding. God will let me in." Before we get into all the inconsistencies and anomalies surrounding this supposed suicide, the hotel room, and even this note itself, or even start to understand how and why this could have happened, first we need to rewind a bit and discuss who exactly this man was. Joseph Daniel Casolaro, Jr., better known as Danny, was born on June 15, 1947, in Fort Meade, Maryland, but grew up nearby in McLean. He was the second of 6 children born into a Catholic family with a very successful obstetrician as a father. He was preceded in death by a brother who was born with a heart defect and passed away at the tender age of 1, and an older sister who passed away from a drug overdose at only 17. Danny would attend Providence College, a private Catholic university located in Providence, Rhode Island, and graduated in 1968. Soon after, he would marry the girl of his dreams, Terrell Pace, who was a former Miss Virginia, and the couple would have a son who they named Trey. They wouldn't have the easiest marriage, but the couple would stick it out for Trey's sake at least for 10 years before they divorced, with Danny receiving legal custody of Trey. Described by those who knew him as being upbeat, golden-haired, Gatsby-esque, romantic, with a love of poetry, raising Arabian horses, an amateur boxer, and a known ladies' man. He was charismatic and kind. His disarming demeanor allowed him to quickly make friends and served him well in his journalistic endeavors. Journalism was a passion of Danny's, but he struggled to find very much success in the field in the early days. He did some writing on a few political stories and considered himself a Washington correspondent, but most of his writing was published in trade journals and supermarket tabloids like the National Star, the National Enquirer, and the Globe. He had at least one novel to his name by the time of his death, titled The Ice King. By the 80s, he decided to set his journalistic ambitions aside, and him, along with 2 other friends, ran a trade publication for the rapidly growing computer industry called Computer Age. And they covered inside stories about the computer business. One of those friends was Terry Miller, a computer contracts expert and contributing consultant for Computer Age. It would be Terry who would introduce Danny to a story that was gaining traction inside and outside of the computer industry at the time. This story would reignite Danny's passion for journalism and lead him on an over 12-month journey into some of the darkest corners of U.S. intelligence, global black ops, money laundering, and embezzlement and corruption at the highest levels of U.S. politics. What he found more than intrigued him. It became an obsession, and he had to get to the truth. A truth he had all but fully discovered. All he needed were a few more documents, and to speak with his final sources. Ones that promised to help him put the final pieces into place. They give him all that he needed to fully expose the group that he had taken to calling the Octopus. Which is precisely why he came to Martinsburg, and how he wound up in that bathtub. Before we can get back to that fateful August night, though, we first have to follow that same trail of breadcrumbs, and we have to try our hand at putting all of the pieces together. Pieces that are scattered across the globe, from the highest office in the nation to a seedy casino way out in the deserts of California, through Iran, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, to the world of conmen, hitmen, spooks, drug dealers, and mobsters, down a long and very windy road that will eventually lead us back to West Virginia and hopefully to the truth. Every journey begins with the first step, and our first step starts at a relatively small, and at the time, virtually unknown outside of the law enforcement and legal communities, software development company called Inslaw. Part 2. How this all began. Inslaw first started out as a tiny nonprofit called the Institute for Law and Social Research, which was founded in 1973 by William A. Hamilton alongside his wife Nancy to develop case management software to solve what was a major hurdle for law enforcement and the court system at the time, and that being the ability to easily and efficiently track cases as well as the information regarding defendants, lawyers, and witnesses between jurisdictions. This led them to develop a first-of-its-kind centralized system for law enforcement record-keeping and case monitoring activities. Since the pair clearly weren't great at acronyms, hence how the Institute for Law and Social Research came to be known as Inslaw, they named this software PROMIS, P-R-O-M-I-S, which stood for Prosecutors Management Information Systems. The first customers of the software were the U.S. Attorney's Office of D.C. and state and local law enforcement. I'll spare you the technical ins and outs regarding it being originally developed under grants before the Institute became the for-profit Inslaw, and the various versions and builds it underwent, and skip to how the dispute really began. In 1982, Inslaw was awarded a $10 million contract to install the software it had developed in multiple offices by the Executive Office of United States Attorneys, or EOUSA. Issues arose quickly with the contract between Inslaw and EOUSA, but really came to a head during the first year of the contract with the DOJ, who lacked the hardware to run PROMIS in any of the offices covered by their part of the contract. So, as a stopgap measure, Inslaw agreed to provide PROMIS on a timeshare-type basis through a VAX computer. Not getting into all of that here, but basically it allowed the offices to access PROMIS on their computer in Virginia through the use of remote terminals, at least until they could get the needed equipment installed on-site. The EOUSA would claim that they were overcharged for this service and would withhold the much-needed payments to pay out their contract, eventually sending Inslaw into bankruptcy. There is actually a ton more to all of this. We'll touch on some of it later, but I won't bore you with what turned into a very drawn-out contract dispute that turned pretty ugly multiple times, and one that turned into a series of bitter legal battles when the software began popping up on their systems and was self-installed by the DOJ. This is where things started to really get interesting, though. According to documents later uncovered, along with some reliable sources and a few less than reliable ones, it would be discovered that the DOJ had not only stolen and reverse engineered PROMIS, but also added a back door that would supposedly allow for the CIA to spy on any government that the software was sold to, which were several, and also be able to spy on whoever they were spying on as well. According to former Israeli intelligence officer Ari Ben-Menashe, quote, "The PROMIS program created a revolution in intel gathering." He would know since Israel was one of the countries that the CIA sold it to, which in turn allowed them to sell it to neighboring countries like Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, and be able to access their systems. Basically, like the US was already doing with Canada, one of the very first customers of this modified software, essentially kickstarting global electronic surveillance as we know it. We'll get into all of that more in a minute though. For now, let's wrap up with Inslaw and how exactly Danny Casolaro would get wrapped up in this sordid affair. When Inslaw filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1985, DOJ lawyers would attempt to step in and argue that the Chapter 11, which is you don't know much about bankruptcy law, it's like a reorganization. It allows them to hold on to their assets and kind of reshuffle some things. Basically, the different chapters of bankruptcy have different requirements and laws that govern what happens next in the process. So the DOJ wanted the Chapter 11, which would allow the Hamiltons to retain rights to the Promise software, be changed to a Chapter 7, which would in turn force them to liquefy their assets and sell them, namely selling off the rights to the Promise software. This is truly where the Hamiltons first started suspecting something was amiss and would start digging. This digging would start pointing to a sort of cabal of senior government officials, including Ronald Reagan's first Attorney General, Ed Meese, who was formerly AG under Nixon, as well as several others who were involved in a greater plot to steal Promise and sell it to intelligence agencies around the world. Apparently, the evidence was compelling enough to convince a DC bankruptcy court and Judge George Basin in 1988 because he awarded the company $6.8 million in damages plus $1.2 million in attorney's fees. In the judge's written decision, he indicated his decision was based on the fact that the DOJ, quote, took, converted, stole the software through trickery, fraud, and deceit, and that the agency, quote, unlawfully, intentionally, and willfully, this guy really likes his descriptives in threes clearly, sought to turn the filing into a Chapter 7 liquidation case, end quote. William, or better known as Bill Hamilton, the creator of the software, was an interesting character in all of this as well, though. His evidence for the DOJ conspiracy came from some dubious places. One of those places was from a guy named Michael Riconosciuto, who had called Hamilton up to tell him that he had the Promise source code and displayed having intimate technical knowledge regarding the software. Riconosciuto is a story unto himself and incredibly difficult to really nail down. While his reliability is oftentimes questionable, understanding him and his possible connections to a lot of what we will discuss in this series is crucial to making sense of it all. He's the son of Marshall and Twyla Riconosciuto. He grew up in Tacoma, Washington, and was a boy prodigy by 10. He began developing alternative telephone systems in his neighborhood. He would connect with all of his friends, though articles and info on it are kind of scant. He was heralded as a modern-day Da Vinci at age 12 in an article by the Tacoma News-Tribune and Ledger describing the network that he set up, as well as experiments using underwater microphones and plant cognition. An intercom system that he had developed in his home, and a radio class that he had had a hand in teaching at his local YMCA. I mean, this guy is a crazy, crazy story. Before his junior year in high school, he had built and was living in an underwater house, one that was fully equipped with TVs, radios, and common house necessities. When he was a teenager, he had already constructed a working argon laser, an accomplishment that was so impressive he was invited to work as a research assistant with a Nobel laureate at Stanford University. His work in underwater acoustics in the field of lasers brought him to the attention, of course, of the U.S. Navy, who offered him several scholarships. Unfortunately, the line between genius and madman tends to be a thin one at times, and Riconosciuto is definitely no exception to that. By age 24, he would be arrested for allegedly manufacturing LSD, PCP, and MDA, which he was creating in his underwater lab to avoid detection. At least, that's the government's position. According to Michael, this only happened after repeated attempts by military and U.S. intelligence to conscript and control him had failed to work. He would only serve 2 years, after which his career trajectory gets a lot harder to substantiate and track. In his conversation with Bill Hamilton, he would begin to lay out a narrative regarding why Promise was so desirable, and it would span the globe. He explained that he was hired to work on weapons projects at the Cabazon Indian Reservation, more on that in just a minute, where the software would be brought to him to install a back door. Brought by whom, you ask? None other than Earl Bryan, a director of Hadron Inc., Inslaw's chief competitor, and confidant to Ronald Reagan and Ed Meese, as well as someone the Hamiltons had already complained attempted to buy Promise, and when Hamilton refused, allegedly told him the old time-tested mafia pitch of, "We have ways of making you sell." Shortly before Inslaw's legal trouble and court battles with the DOJ would begin, Riconosciuto would lay out these allegations in a 12-page memo presented to the Hamiltons. This software was allegedly a gift to Earl Bryan for work that Hadron had done for Bill Casey, friend of Reagan and soon-to-be CIA director, for facilitating a $40 million payment to the Iranians as a payoff to encourage them to delay releasing U.S. hostages that they held until after the 1980 presidential election. They would make good on their word, and what would come to be known as the infamous October surprise would go off without a hitch, and the hostages would then be released hours after Reagan took office. Not diving too deep into all of that, because it is an episode-worthy story, this played a very, very key role in securing Reagan a seat in the Oval Office. Upon learning of all of this, the Hamiltons would become eager to share their story with any journalist, freelance or otherwise, who would listen to them. Casolaro around this time had been introduced to the Inslaw case by Terry Miller as a contract dispute to cover for Computer Age. In the summer of 1990, Casolaro would connect with the Hamiltons via a contact who was embedded in the extremely insane Lyndon LaRouche cultist. That's a story for another day for sure. But these guys also claim to have their own intel operations with connections to the administration. It's a whole deal. I have no idea how Casolaro was connected to those guys. Just felt it was worth mentioning. Casolaro was immediately intrigued and quickly recognized the story as being significant, but the Riconosciuto memo would be the piece that altered his life and would send him down a road of obsession with the case and its larger implications. Riconosciuto claims that his connections to Earl Bryan began when he, for whatever reason, was asked to go with him to help facilitate the money exchange in Iran to secure Reagan's victory. I was unable to substantiate his presence in this deal though, and personally, I kind of doubt it, if I'm being honest. Regardless, the Promise software was very likely worked on at the Cabazon Indian Reservation, and Riconosciuto was definitely present there. So if we are to try and follow this Byzantine labyrinth to its conclusion, this seems like the most logical place for us to start digging a little bit deeper ourselves. Because the series of events that took place out in that desert would lead to the untimely deaths of at least 4 people, and would play a major role in how the Promise saga would unfold. It would also directly help to facilitate the Reagan administration's illegal arms sales to Iran, thus assisting in arming and funding the anti-Sandinista rebel group, the Contras, a far-right terrorist group essentially created by the CIA with the hopes of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government and yet another CIA-sponsored coup on a very long list. The money generated and weapons produced through this venture would also contribute to multiple off-book CIA black ops and play a significant role in the agency's many nefarious activities throughout the 80s. And it all started with a tiny band of Native Americans, unsurprisingly being taken advantage of on their little piece of sovereign land in the California desert. Part 3. Cabazon Arms. Cabazon Indians were a very small band, Cahuilla tribe adjacent Native Americans who maintained a reservation on what was considered sovereign land in the Southern California desert area outside of Indio in the Riverside County area of California. By 1978, the tribe had dwindled down to around 26 members and was struggling to maintain. This would be about the time that a man by the name of Dr. John Philip Nichols would move to the reservation and change the course of their lives in a drastic way. If you asked 10 people their thoughts on Nichols, you would likely get 10 different opinions. His son Bobby describes him somewhat ominously as an agent of social change. He's definitely a man with a very shadowy past, at any rate, and deep connections to the CIA. What little is known about him, his career seemingly begins with working with labor unions and organizers, learning the tools of that trade. After this, he would be sent to South America, working in some area of U.S. policy and rubbing elbows with many big names in U.S. government. He would pop up in Rio in '58 and Chile in '65, when he would help organize indigenous people into a voting bloc to counteract the Chilean government. at a time when the CIA was hard at work destabilizing them already. He would pop up here and there around the world, typically in areas of ongoing operations, before ending up at the Cabazon Reservation in 1978. The good work that he did, we call it that, to stabilize the tribe by using federal loopholes to establish a tax-free smoke shop, cheap liquor, and the first poker casino to ever be built on an Indian reservation, which led to the tribe having health insurance as well as some new opportunities in employment and education, would all soon be outshadowed by his true intentions as they became more and more evident. If you didn't already suspect this, Nichols was an old-time CIA operative linked with assassination attempts on both Fidel Castro and Salvador Allende of Chile, as well as being closely associated with mafia connections and even Jimmy Hoffa, who he likely met during his union organizing days. As the money from these ventures came rolling in, a little would go to the tribe for benefits and this and that, but the lion's share, it would seem, was flowing to and through Nichols' hands. A tribe member named Fred Alvarez, who was a member of the tribal council as well as the head of security for the casino under Nichols, would begin to get more and more suspicious of Nichols' intentions, curious about the increasingly wide array of suspicious activities he saw, and would begin to ask questions and raise concerns. Other tribe members would also share his concerns, and Alvarez would decide to try to take action to remove Nichols from the reservation. His first move was to go to speak with an attorney about the matter, who would listen to what he had to say, but insisted that he would need further proof of Nichols' crimes in order to help him. Late one night, Alvarez would sneak into the tribal office where Nichols kept his files, and remove what he needed to prove his case. Alvarez would schedule an appointment with his attorney to bring the evidence for July 1st of 1981. Joe Benitez and Bill Calloway, both fellow tribal members, would agree to take Alvarez to the appointment. But when they arrived that morning to pick him up, they were unable to get him to come to the door. The pair would make their way into his backyard, hoping to try that door, but would make a grim discovery before they could. Fred Alvarez, his girlfriend Patricia Castro, and friend Ralph Boger all lay deceased, shot execution style with a single bullet to the head from a .38 caliber handgun. And the records that he had taken were not recovered from the scene, but they contained evidence of much, much more than just money skimming. In the files was evidence of large arms deals, as well as a joint venture between Cabazon and a company called Wackenhut for a government-backed weapons manufacturing enterprise involving both biological and chemical weapons Nichols was planning to produce on the tribal land. Wackenhut, a terrible name, first started in 1954 when George R. Wackenhut, along with 3 other former FBI special agents, formed a company in Miami of special agent investigators to provide investigative services to business and industry. In 1955, a second company was formed to apply the same approach to physical security problems, and in 1958, they were combined under the Wackenhut Corporation umbrella. The company would become more and more inexorably linked to the U.S. government, providing more and more services, and by this time, they were in charge of security for top-secret high-level government installations like Area 51, Groom Lake, and most nuclear weapons facilities, and more. The board was made up of mostly ex-CIA along with a few from the FBI, NSA, and upper branches of government. In 1965, it boasted having the largest private database of, quote, left-leaning subversives with files on some 2.5 million Americans. Wackenhut was essentially carrying out covert activities worldwide with the CIA cosign, and with Alvarez out of the way at this point, Nichols would face little resistance as he went forward with the next phase of operations, which is when he would bring in Reconocido and what Casolaro would call a, quote, elite squad of sociopathic creatures, angels of life and death. 2 months after this, people would begin rolling into the reservation to watch weapons demos at the Lake Cholula firing range hosted by Nichols and Company, where their endeavors could be carried out on a sovereign land and away from prying eyes, or so they thought. Everything from weapons development to global arms sales would take place with visitors from conflict zones like the Nicaraguas, particularly Eden Pastora, aka Anti-Sandinista Commander Zero. The profits would be moved through a money laundering slush fund at the Bank of Credit and Commerce, or BCCI, and doled out to operatives carrying out dirty tricks and coups on the behalf of the U.S. intelligence apparatus worldwide. This was also about the time that, according to Riconosciuto, Earl Bryan would pay a visit to offload the stolen Promise software for modification. I have another version of this story, though, that I've uncovered, that we'll get into more in a later chapter. Alvarez would be replaced as head of security by a man named Jimmy Hughes at the casino that was funded and deeply connected to the mob. A self-professed mafia hitman like Hughes seems a logical choice for that. In 1985, a reporter for NBC News, Patrick Healy, would interview Hughes in relation to the Alvarez slayings, where he would refer to it as a, quote, ordered assassination, also adding that the hit was, quote, an authorized, backed, government covert action. Opinions differ as to if he was the trigger man or simply the bag man for a mafia hit for Alvarez, but after that interview, he would flee to Honduras to start over as some sort of minister. He would later be arrested thanks to the efforts of Rachel Begley, who is the daughter of victim Ralph Boger, on September 26, 2009 at the Miami-Dade International Airport before he could board a flight back to Honduras. On July 1, 2010, however, 9 months after his arrest and, ironically, on the 29th anniversary of the slaying of Alvarez, Castro, and Boger, the state AG would get the case dismissed, setting Hughes free once more. Back to Cabazon, 6 months after the Alvarez murders, Riconosciuto's best friend and business partner, who was also the suspected money man of the Cabazon operation, Paul Marosca, would be found dead in San Francisco, hog-tied in a way where if he had lowered his legs, it would strangle him, with a wire connected around his neck to his feet. Being the money handler at the reservation, Paul had access to all of the BCCI and offshore accounts, and it's believed that he was killed for that information. Before his death, he told his then-girlfriend that he feared for his life and was afraid of a man named Jason killing him, a man that he described as a CIA hitman. Investigators would find, quote, Jason's real name to be Philip Arthur Thompson, codename Jason Smith. When investigators closed in, however, it would be told to them by FBI that he was an informant. From here, the FBI would proceed to stonewall the case and protect their supposed informant. After Paul's death, Riconosciuto would begin fearing that he was going to be next, and would leave the Cabazon operation shortly thereafter. Thompson was also connected to a string of other very suspicious murders, but never did any real time, even in the rare instance that one of those cases made it to trial, as the FBI repeatedly stepped in to get him released. Thompson also had deep connections to Nichols and to the CIA. After Paul's torture and subsequent death, all accounts tied to the Cabazon were completely drained, and the Cabazon operation was effectively bankrupted. This is far from the end of the story for those involved, and in many ways, only the beginning of ours. The Wackenhut and Intel Services connection shouldn't be overlooked or downplayed. John Conley, former NYPD detective turned investigative journalist, spoke about Wackenhut in a 1992 Spy magazine article that he penned titled Inside the Shadow CIA, What? Where he said the following, quote, a big private company, one with a board of former CIA, FBI, and Pentagon officials, one in charge of protecting nuclear weapon facilities, nuclear reactors, and the Alaskan oil pipeline, in more than a dozen American embassies abroad, one with long-standing ties to radical right organizations, one with 30,000 men and women under arms, secretly helped Iraq in its efforts to obtain sophisticated weapons, and fueled unrest in Venezuela? This is all the plot of a new best-selling thriller, right? Or the ravings of some overheated conspiracy buff, right? Wrong. End quote. This company has some very, very dark ties that would take a very long time to outline, and would most likely become too repetitive or unbelievable to stand listening to. The biggest takeaway, though, is that they were absolutely a major component of the Cabazon operation, and are very deeply connected to U.S. intelligence as well as the government as a whole. It wasn't terribly long after Riconosciuto fled the Cabazon arms op that he would connect with the Hamiltons and subsequently lay out all of his allegations in that 12-page memo to them detailing the road Promise took after it was stolen. The Earl Bryan, who for the record looks like a fat Al Gore, prove me wrong, Bill Casey and Hadron connections, and more. When Danny Casolaro reached out to the Hamiltons and became entwined in the Inslaw case drama, it was really that memo that would throw fire on his already burning flames to find the truth of it all. Connecting with Riconosciuto, a man the Hamiltons had already, according to Bill, been told he could be killed just for knowing, and who Casolaro would come to call Danger Man in his notes, would be the first of many connections that would soon lead him down a dangerous path, rife with shadowy characters, government corruption at the highest levels, and a worldwide story of espionage and deceit that would eventually lead him to what he referred to as the head of the Octopus, which is precisely what drew him to room 517 of that Martinsburg Sheraton. I told you at the start, though, to get back there and even have the slightest chance of fully understanding what most likely really happened, we had to follow the same clues, and to take that journey for ourselves. Riconosciuto and Cabazon was our first step, just as it was for Danny. But this is only how our story starts. Just one leg of this octopus, and a highly condensed and greatly simplified one at that. As we go along on this journey, we'll discuss things that will fill in even more of what we've covered tonight, because this isn't a story that can really be told correctly in a linear fashion. And much to my chagrin, it definitely can't all be covered in a single episode. So after just wrapping up that massive 3-part series one episode ago, and despite swearing off these huge research-heavy multi-part series for the rest of the season at least, here we are again. This is a story that I needed to cover though, and the more that I found, the bigger it got. This isn't a rabbit hole as I first thought. It's more, like I said at the start, a Byzantine labyrinth of vast and interconnected rabbit holes that at times feels bottomless. At the end of it all though is a story that still needs to be told in full, and a journey that I think you will be glad you chose to undertake. So if what you've heard tonight piqued your interest, then meet me back here Friday of next week at 8 p.m., and together we will embark on the next leg of our adventure, and begin to start putting some of the most crucial pieces of this puzzle together. When all is said and done, hopefully, we will be able to finally answer a question that has plagued police, researchers, and his family for over 30 years. What really happened to Danny Casolaro? Guys, this story gets crazier from here. And this episode really just a pretty condensed version of most of the groundwork that's required to really try and tell this story or get you to be able to understand it the way it needs to be understood. Events that take place throughout it ripple out and they reach everything from, I'm talking Epstein and the Maxwells to back to Iran-Contra and well beyond both of those. I've dug through every document I can get my hands on, watched every documentary, and read at least 100 articles or so, and no one seems to have anything really close to the complete picture of it all. And I can't sit here in good faith and tell you that even after all of that I do either. What I can say is, I've put together a much more complete picture than what I've seen laid out anywhere else so far, and I'm excited to be able to bring it to you guys. Thank you, as always, for listening, for sharing the show, for the follows, the likes, the interactions. It all means the world, guys. I couldn't do it without you amazing folks. Well, I guess I could, but it would be pretty pointless and extremely boring. Seriously, though, you guys are the best. You make it all worthwhile, and I can't thank you enough. Shout out to the new listeners and follows. I'm really glad that you took the time to join us. And shout out to the Discord group for all of your support, as always, and links will be dropped there first and early. And I'll be in there tonight from, say, 9 to 10 Central Time, maybe later. If anyone has any questions, the link for that is in the Facebook bio, and we try to do live Q&As after every show if anyone's interested, so come on and join us. And until we speak again, stay safe out there, wherever you may be. Take care of yourselves, one another, and I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.